Well, good morning. Welcome back. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and this is what I call my morning musings. I'm in the beginning discussion of Satan, demon possession, etc., and the question of whether or not Satan has been defeated. As I mentioned in the introductory lesson, one of the key objections that is offered by the adversaries of covenant eschatology is they say, you claim Satan's been destroyed. Look around. All you got to do is look at the world. I'm currently in a written debate with a guy named Olin Hicks, and that's his key argument. Just look around. It's funny that although the New Testament writers affirm without any doubt that the saints were ruling with Christ on thrones and that they were triumphing over their enemies, it's funny that they never said, hey, look around. It's because they never urged them to look at the external circumstances of the world. Because if you looked at the external circumstances of the world at the very time that Paul and the New Testament writers were saying, you are more than conquerors. You're seated on thrones. You're judging the world. Well, if you would have looked at the world, you would have had to go, oh, really? We're judging the world? We're rulers? We're conquerors? So you see, looking around was not the criteria to determine whether or not Christ himself had triumphed. Looking around was not the criteria of judgment to determine whether Christ had triumphed over all of the principalities and the powers. Colossians 2:14, where Paul says specifically that Christ had triumphed already in the cross, triumphed over every power, every principality, and he triumphed over them in the cross. Oh, really? Really? Look around, some might have said. The Romans triumphed. The Jews triumphed. The Jews were triumphing over the church, as Paul wrote in Romans 8 and said, we're more than conquerors. Looking around, once again, was not and is not the criteria of judgment to determine, number one, whether or not the kingdom has been established. Number two, it is not the criteria of judgment for whether or not Christ was seated at the right hand with all of his enemies, having already been put under him. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 20 through 28, except at that point, the last enemy except death. You see, you've got to catch the power of that verse. Just look around, we are told. The enemies of Christ haven't been put down. Well, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 20 through 28, says, he has put all things under his feet, all things except death at that time. Wait a minute. Just look around, Paul. Just look around. Everything except death had already been put down. That's what Paul says. He had already triumphed over all of the powers, all of the principalities. He was just waiting for the last enemy. Now watch this. He was about to do to death what he had already done to all things in subjecting them. Well, just look around. If you could not look around, as we are challenged to do, if you could not look around at the time of Paul and see that Christ had already put all things under his feet, if the criteria of judgment was not the physical eyes, in regard to all things having already been put under his feet, then why should we expect that when death was put under his feet, that death, the putting down of death, would be visibly evident to the physical eye? It is because looking around was not and is not the criteria to determine whether or not Christ won, whether or not Satan was defeated, whether or not the kingdom has been established. The kingdom does not come with observation. Luke 17:20 and 21. You know, I realize that I promised you that in this segment I was going to share with you some really, really dynamite stuff. Well, I just did, but that's not what I was going to share with you today. I decided to hold off until next week because I wanted to set the stage just a little bit more for the question, and it segues perfectly from this segment where looking around is not the factor to determine whether or not Christ triumphed. Okay? Remember, Paul said Christ, at the time he wrote 1 Corinthians 15, already had put all things under his feet except the last enemy. And he was going to do to death what he had already done to all things. Paul said Christ had already triumphed over all principalities, over all powers. And yet the visible looking around would not have suggested that. So for those who say, all you got to do is look around and know that, well, all you got to do is look around and know that the kingdom hasn't been established. All you got to do is look around and know that Satan is with us. Well, all you had to do is look around, according to Paul, to know that man of sin had already been restrained. In other words, Satan had already been bound. All you had to do is look around, according to Jesus, to know that Satan was already bound. All you had to do is look around to know that the kingdom was in the process of being established. No, that's not what he said, is it? He never said, look around, guys. See? No, the kingdom does not come with observation. We do not look at the things that are seen, but at the things that are unseen. We've known Christ after the flesh. We will know him after the flesh no more. 2 Corinthians 5:16. Now there's a lot in that passage having to do with in the flesh, but it certainly includes his human experience, his human physical experience. So, I'm waiting until Monday. I won't be with you tomorrow. I'll be in Dallas, Texas, speaking at the Criswell Bible College lectureship. Keep me in your prayers about that. I'm super, super excited. Okay, so when it comes to the defeat of Satan, what I've shared with you this morning is that when people say, just look around, anyone can see that Satan is still in control. That is not the criteria of judgment. The Bible is very clear that in the first century, Christ had already triumphed over Satan, but Paul never said, look around. Satan was already bound, but Paul never said, just look around to see it's true. Christ and the saints were already enthroned, ruling, reigning, judging. But Paul never said, just look at the world and you know it's true. Instead, the New Testament writers, number one, they affirmed that everything except death had been put down, already conquered, already subjected in the first century. That all principalities and powers had already been conquered, Colossians 2:14. But they also affirmed the kingdom does not come with observation. As a matter of fact, Paul said, you put too much emphasis, writing to the Corinthians, on the things that are seen. 2 Corinthians 10. Okay. Thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. We will see you on the flip side.